this is Jose Figueroa with an approved workman, where we are rightly dividing the word of truth. Welcome to another week of Bible study. I am glad that you're here as we open up God's Word one more time. Our current series is Rebuilding the Covenant Community, a study of the book of Nehemiah. If you're new to this Bible teaching ministry, here's how you can learn more about our work. You can go to our website, www.anapprovedworkman.org. That's anapprovedworkman altogether.org. You can learn about the purpose for this ministry, our approach to Bible study, and review our statement of faith. You can listen to previous episodes of our current series or any episodes from previous series. On the website, you can also subscribe to the podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Amazon Music, as well as other podcast directories. You can connect with us on social media, on Instagram at @anapprovedworkman, on Pinterest, pinterest.com/anapprovedworkman, and on Facebook, our Facebook page, facebook.com/anapprovedworkman215. Finally, there are also video versions of our Bible study lessons. They're available on YouTube at youtube.com/@anapprovedworkman215. That's our handle. And on Rumble, rumble.com/c/anapprovedworkman. You can subscribe to those video channels and make sure you don't miss any upcoming episodes. In today's episode, we are continuing our series After the Exile, a study of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Have you ever had to start over? Maybe your career took a downturn and you find yourself looking for a new position after many years of good and loyal service to your employer. Perhaps you lost your lifetime partner due to death or divorce. Now you're single again and trying to figure out how life goes on without that special person. Maybe you were hit with a major financial or health crisis. You thought things were under control. Now you're trying to put the pieces together to move forward. Whatever your situation, it's a moment of rebuilding, of starting over. You need restoration. What do you do? Where do you turn? The people of Israel had been called out of Egypt and chosen as God's special inheritance from among the nations. They had God's law and a covenant with Him. They were to be His people, and He was going to be their God. The promises of God were fulfilled through Joshua in the conquest of the Promised Land. And after the transitional period of the judges, the people of God enjoyed their greatest prosperity during the reigns of David and Solomon. But after Solomon's death, the kingdom was split into two. This was God's judgment for Solomon's failure to remain loyal to the Lord. The history of the divided kingdom is a downward spiral as the people fail to remain loyal to Yahweh. God had made it clear in the Torah, in the law of Moses, that spiritual adultery would lead to judgment via exile. In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, and then repatriated the population. In 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire conquered the southern kingdom, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and exiled most of the population to Babylon. Through the prophet Jeremiah, God had promised that the exile will last 70 years so the land would enjoy a Sabbath rest. Despite his people's unfaithfulness, God remains faithful. Now living under the Persian Empire, the people of God are given permission to return to the land, to rebuild the temple, and eventually the city of Jerusalem. Still, questions remain. Are we still the chosen people of God? Are the promises to Abraham and David still in effect? Is there truly hope for us? Is Yahweh still for us? The answer is yes, because God had plans for a future and a hope for his people, as he told them in Jeremiah 29:11. And because he loves them with an everlasting love, Jeremiah 31:3 and 4. He's not done with them. Today, we are resuming our series called After the Exile, a study of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. We're moving to volume 2 of our series, and we're going to focus on the book of Nehemiah. We're learning how God used people like Zerubbabel, Joshua, Haggai, Zechariah, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and Mordecai. They took action to help the people of God rebuild their lives and return to him. The Lord, sovereign in history and the universe, also moved in the hearts of pagan kings to orchestrate good things for his people. God is sovereign and he is in control. His plans and purposes are never thwarted. In this series, we are also learning that despite trials and tribulations, we can always return to God and his promises for us will be fulfilled. Last time we concluded Volume 1, our study of Ezra, a series we call Rebuilding on the Solid Rock. Today we'll spend time reviewing the context for the entire series, and then we'll do an introduction of Volume 2, the study of the book of Nehemiah, which we're calling Rebuilding the Covenant Community. Let's get started. Let's take a look at the timeline, the historical setting for the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. This comes from the Ryrie Study Bible by Dr. Charles Caldwell Ryrie. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, conquered Judah in 586 BC. In 538 BC, Cyrus, king of Persia, decreed that the Jews could return to their homeland. The temple construction, under a very small group of exiles that returned, began in 535 BC. It was met with opposition by enemies of God's people, and then the people of God got distracted and discouraged. Darius I became king of Persia in 521 BC. In 520 BC, the Lord sent the prophets Haggai and Zechariah to stir the people to complete the temple rebuilding project, which was accomplished in 515 BC. Moving ahead in our story, Ahasuerus became king of Persia in 486 BC, and then in 479 BC, Esther came into the picture and she became queen of Persia. It was in 474 BC where Haman, the enemy of the Jews, he basically worked out a decree to kill all the Jews in the Persian Empire. Through the hand of providence of God and the actions of Esther and Mordecai, that fate was averted and the Feast of Purim was established. In 464 BC, Artaxerxes I became the king of Persia. Ezra, the priest and the scribe, went to Jerusalem in 458 BC. And then in 444, 443 BC, Nehemiah, the cupbearer to the king, went to Jerusalem to have the walls of the city rebuilt. The events depicted in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther all occur within the Persian Empire context. This also comes from the Ryrie Study Bible. If you look at the Persian kings as they rule, Cyrus ruled between 559 and 530 BC. And then Cambyses followed him and he reigned between 530 and 522 BC. Smerdis reigned briefly in 522 BC, and then Darius I reigned all the way from 521 BC and 486 BC. So when you look at those Persian king dates, The corresponding chapters in Ezra, for example, are Ezra 1 through 6, although there is no mention of Cambyses or Smyrna. In relation to other books of the Old Testament, you can look at the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, which prophesy between 520 and 518 BC. The next Persian king that shows up in history is Xerxes I or Ahasuerus. There is a reference to him in Ezra chapter 4, verse 6, and this is the king in the book of Esther, 465 BC. Artaxerxes I began to reign between 464 and 424 BC. There were references to him in Ezra chapter 4, verses 7 to 23, and chapters 7 through 10. And also, this is the context for the book of Malachi. Finally, Darius II reigned between 423 and 404 BC, and that also covers Nehemiah's ministry, which started in 445 BC and then ended in 425 BC. Let's take a look now at the geographical setting of the series after the exile. There were three returns from Babylon back to the land of Israel, to Jerusalem and Judah. First, in 539 BC, King Cyrus had the first decree that all the Jews that were exiled to Babylon could return to their homeland and rebuild the temple. A small contingent of Jews returned under the leadership of Zerubbabel, about 50,000 of them. In 458 BC, Ezra described, he led a smaller group of Jews back to Judea, and he took the shorter, more dangerous desert route that passed through Tadmor. So again, Ezra's focus was back on restoring the worship, the proper worship of Yahweh. And then in 445 BC, which is the focus of our new series on Nehemiah, he was in Susa serving as King Artaxerxes' cupbearer, but he was granted permission by the king to travel back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city and the city wall. So those are the three returns of Jewish exiles from Babylon back to Judah. Just like there had been three waves of exile, there were three waves of return. After reviewing the context for the entire series, let's focus now on Volume 2, our introduction to the book of Nehemiah. We are calling this series on Nehemiah, Rebuilding the Covenant Community. Our key passage for the study is Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 15 and 16. So the wall was completed on the 25th of the month Elul in 52 days. When all our enemies heard about it and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence, for they realized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Let's walk through the scriptural and historical setting for the book of Nehemiah. God told his people that if they chose to break their covenant with him, he would again allow other nations to take him into slavery. He warned them of that in one of many places, but Jeremiah 2:14 and 15. True to his promises, God brought the Assyrians and the Babylonians to issue his chastisement upon wayward Israel and Judah. Because Judah persisted in her unfaithfulness to the covenant, God chastened his people with 70 years of captivity, from which they returned to Jerusalem, as reported and recorded by Ezra and Nehemiah. Cyrus of Persia overthrew Babylon in October 539, and, in accord with his policy of encouraging subject people to return to their homelands, he issued a decree in 538 allowing the Jews to do the same. About 50,000 of them did return under the leadership of Zerubbabel, and the foundation of the temple was laid, although it was not completed until 515 during the reign of Darius. As there had been three waves of deportation from Israel into Babylon, 605 BC, 597 BC, and 586 BC. So there was actually three returns to Jerusalem over a 9-decade span. However, complete, uncontested political autonomy never returned. And this information comes from a combination of the MacArthur Bible Commentary by Dr. John MacArthur and the Ryrie Study Bible by Dr. Charles Caldwell Ryrie. Let's now look at the authorship and composition of the book of Nehemiah. The book details the final chronological events of the Old Testament and encourages Jews in the post-exilic communities to remain obedient to the Mosaic law. The main theme of Nehemiah is the restoration of the city's walls. Nehemiah receives its title from its author. The name Nehemiah means Yahweh comforts, or my comfort is Yahweh. Nehemiah was the son of Hakaliah, who is otherwise unknown. The events of the book of Nehemiah take place during the reign of the Persian king Artaxerxes. Nehemiah served as the official cupbearer of the king, a position of great importance and influence in ancient Near Eastern courts. The last historical event recorded in Nehemiah references the reign of Darius II, who ruled from 424 to 404 BC, and that's in Nehemiah 12, verse 22. The book was likely completed at some point in the reign of Darius II, with a date near the beginning of his reign the most probable. The book is best dated to within 5 years of 420 BC. Nehemiah may be the final book written in the Old Testament. In terms of the historical order, Ezra returned in the 7th year of Artaxerxes I, 458 BC, while Nehemiah returned in the 20th year of Artaxerxes I, 444 BC. This view, which is currently the traditional approach, is the most faithful to the biblical text. And that information comes from the Lexham Bible Dictionary, an entry on the book of Nehemiah by Israel P. Loken. Let's now look at the man himself. Who is Nehemiah? He was the governor of Judah and the son of Hakaliah. He governed Judah in the 20th to 32nd year of Artaxerxes, between the years 465, 424 BC. So he had two terms that were interrupted. So there was his first term, then he went back to Susa, the capital, and then he came back for a second term as governor. In his first term, he convinced the king to let him return to Jerusalem to help his people who had survived the exile and were in great trouble and shame. So a lot of the book is recorded in the first person narrative. He went back to Jerusalem to rebuild its walls and institute religious reforms. He also dealt with the issues of observance of the Sabbath and intermarriage. And as you recall, if you were with us for the series on Ezra, intermarriage was a big deal for the people of God as they returned back to Judah. And although Nehemiah is never called a prophet, nor is his work placed among the prophetic writings, his ministry nevertheless resembles that of the prophets in the way he dealt with the people and his devotion to the law of the Lord. Nehemiah is also often regarded as the consummate servant leader. This information comes from two entries in the Lexham Bible Dictionary. First, an entry on Nehemiah, the governor of Judah, from Jason Silverman, and again, an entry by Israel P. Loken on Nehemiah, the book itself. So Nehemiah, he was the cupbearer, he was a governor, he was a builder, and he was a servant leader committed to the Lord and to his people. Let's take a moment to review the content outline for the book of Nehemiah, and this comes again from the Israel P. Loken entry in the Lexham Bible Dictionary. So Nehemiah again records the final events chronologically of the Old Testament in 4 sections. Chapter 1, beginning in verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 20, it announces Nehemiah's mission following a distressing report from his brother Hanani. chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, all the way to chapter 7, verse 3, describes the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem by the Jewish remnant. Then, beginning in chapter 7, verse 4, all the way to chapter 13, verse 3, it details Nehemiah's efforts to restore the remnant spiritually, rebuilding that covenant community. And then finally, chapter 13, verse 4, all the way through verse 31, is an account of Nehemiah's final reforms following his return to Jerusalem. As we do with every series we do here on an approved workman, we rely on depend on several commentaries for our series. So we do our own study, but we also reference and use excellent work by excellent Bible teachers and preachers of the Word of God. So let's spend some time now going through some highlights on the overall message of the book of Nehemiah. Let's start with Dr. David Jeremiah. He has a very helpful, quick reference book, Understanding the 66 Books of the Bible. Here's what he has to say about Nehemiah. He says, quote, Nehemiah received a report from his ancestral city, Jerusalem. The walls there were broken down. The gates were burned with fire, and the survivors were in distress. God deeply burdened Nehemiah with the plight of Jerusalem, and within 4 verses of the beginning of the book, the reader finds Nehemiah weeping, mourning, fasting, and praying. One person, empowered by God, can make a difference, whether that person is Nehemiah or whether that person is you. End quote. Let's now hear from our friends at the Bible Project. Quote, in most modern Bibles, Ezra and Nehemiah is 2 separate books, but that division happened long after it was written. It was originally a unified work written by a single author who lived long after the Babylonians' invasion of Jerusalem and the exile, as recorded in 2 Kings 24:25. Ezra and Nehemiah picks up some 50 years later and tells of the return of some Israelites to Jerusalem and what happened when they rebuilt their lives and the city. The book of Ezra and Nehemiah started out by raising our hopes in the prophetic promises of the Messiah, the temple, and the kingdom of God, but then none of it happens. Even though Israel is back in their land, their spiritual state seems unchanged from before the exile. While Ezra and Nehemiah try their best, their political and social reforms don't change the core issues in the people's hearts. Israel is in need of a holistic transformation of their hearts if they are ever going to love and obey their God. End quote. Through our study of the book of Ezra, and as we will continue with Nehemiah and Esther, we also relied on the great work by Dr. J. Vernon McGee in his Through the Bible commentary on these 3 books. Here's what he had to say about Nehemiah. Quote, Nehemiah was a layman. Ezra was a priest. In the book of Ezra, the emphasis is upon the rebuilding of the temple. In the book of Nehemiah, the emphasis is upon the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah had an important office in the court of the powerful Persian king Artaxerxes, but his heart was with God's people and God's program in Jerusalem. The personal note is the main characteristic of the book. I find myself coming to this book again and again because of the kind of book that it is. End quote. In his Bible commentary, Dr. Tony Evans has this to say about Nehemiah. Quote, Nehemiah led the 3rd return of exiled Jews back to the land of Israel. As cupbearer to the king of Persia, he held an important administrative post in the government. With the blessing of a pagan king, Nehemiah returned home to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, the city of God. This demonstrates that even the secular world is subject to God when his people operate according to his kingdom promises and authority. The book of Nehemiah is about making wrong things right. End quote. In his Bible commentary, Dr. John MacArthur has this to say about the book of Nehemiah. He says, quote, "The events in Nehemiah chapter 1 began late in the year 446 BC, the 20th year of the Persian king Artaxerxes. At the most critical juncture in Judah's revitalization, God raised up Nehemiah, whose name means Jehovah comforts, to exercise one of the most trusted roles in the empire, the king's cupbearer and confidant. God worked through the obedience of Nehemiah. However, he also worked through the wrongly motivated, wicked hearts of his enemies. But the exemplary behavior of the famous cupbearer is eclipsed by God, who orchestrated the reconstruction of the walls in spite of much opposition and many setbacks. The good hand of God theme carries through the book of Nehemiah." End quote. In his commentary on Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, Dr. Mervyn Brenneman has this to say, quote, "Like the book of Ezra, the book of Nehemiah may be understood in terms of the faithfulness and holiness of God. Nehemiah proved to be a capable leader, diligent in God's work, both for the community of God and the city of David. Glory should not be given to Nehemiah, however, but rather to God, who directed and brought about this event. Just as in Ezra, the providence of God, his loving care, and discipline were the real forces behind the events recorded in these chapters of the book of Nehemiah." End quote. Finally, let's hear from Dr. Derek Kidner from his commentary on Ezra and Nehemiah. He says, quote, "More than half this book is a personal record, punctuated with asides and frank comments which make it, in such parts, one of the liveliest pieces of writing in the Bible. The main action is crowded into the spring and summer of the year 445 BC, in which time Nehemiah not only made the journey from near the Persian Gulf to Jerusalem, but restored the city's walls and gates and began to see to its defense. If Judaism was to earn a name for its zeal for righteousness, it owed it very largely to these two determined men, Ezra and Nehemiah." End quote. So I've included here the full list of references for this study. This will also be posted in the series page for the study of Nehemiah, Rebuilding the Covenant Community. Well, this brings us to the end of our introduction to Volume 2 of our Bible study series After the Exile, a study of Nehemiah, Rebuilding the Covenant Community. So thank you for being here and for listening today. In our next episode, we will have our first lesson in the study of Nehemiah, and we will focus on chapter 1. Until then, this is Jose Figueroa for an approved workman, where we are rightly dividing the word of truth. May God richly bless you.